Hello, everyone. My name is Fiona Schönberg, and I will be touching upon a lot of things that we already heard yesterday. So get ready to hear a bunch of things again, only from someone much less famous. Now, I will be speaking about what I refer to as the cultural logic underlying the genre of contemporary post-apocalyptic fiction. Before I get into what that actually means, I'd like to disclose that this is somewhat of a round two for me tackling this particular topic, as this is an update to my very first academic publication, edited by, among others, Eugen Pfister. Hello. So then, what do I mean by cultural logic? I mean to suggest that beyond the shared aesthetic elements, beyond the commonalities of tropes and narratives, there are some shared underlying assumptions, some ideologic beliefs that permeate the genre, often whether the creators mean to or not. The original chapter thought to identify such assumptions by outlining the contradictions between seemingly anti-capitalist elements present in the lore of various Fallout games, in stark contrast to the downright libertarian positions and ideologies that permeate both the narrative and especially the formal elements of the franchise. But a lot of things have happened to the Fallout franchise since 2021. In its first iteration, this argument had to rely on interpreting a number of incidental motifs. The games use bottle caps in place of money, and that's easy to read as a commentary on the arbitrariness of currency. Similarly, there's moments like this one from Fallout 4, where an NPC has effectively reinvented credit cards and is presented as an obvious scam. And then, of course, there are many, many swipes that the games take in the direction of the military-industrial context, all of which can and have been understood as jabs at capitalism at large. Since then, the franchise has become a lot more overt in its messaging. Fallout 76 is full of fairly overtly anti-capitalist stories and labor conflicts. Entire areas are devoted to little narratives about workers that worry about being replaced by robots and automation. There's drastic, jealously guarded wealth inequality all over Fallout 76's Appalachia. There are violent crackdowns on labor disputes or strikes, the robotic strikebreakers frozen in time by the nuclear apocalypse. There's an entire questline following a single man's descent into militancy as he tries to raise a workplace safety concern, and the mechanisms meant to rein in corporate greed fail him one by one, until he no longer has any recourse but to resort to kidnapping and outright terrorism. And then, of course, earlier this year, the most recent entry into the franchise, Amazon Prime's Fallout TV show, got even more explicit. Here, even the nuclear apocalypse itself, the very thing that shaped the setting, is heavily implied to be the work of a shadowy cabal of captains of industry looking to win at capitalism. And the holdovers of that conspiracy make up the primary antagonistic force that's revealed over the course of the show's first season. Spoilers, I guess. And yet I'm about to argue that the underlying ideology of the Fallout franchise, the foundational assumptions of its narratives and gameplay system, remain anything but anti-capitalist. Now, some fans of the franchise took these changes toward a more overtly political stance with the trademark calm and sensibility we've come to expect from entrenched gaming fandoms, especially when concerning a female-led TV show. But more significant for the purposes of this presentation, this frenzy has prompted a number of key figures that were instrumental to the franchise's conception to comment and clarify their intent. I could, at this point, once again go through the gameplay systems of the Fallout franchise. I could talk about how the game is effectively set up to put the player in a position of constant cost-benefit calculations. I could talk about how the games, especially the older games that had the karma system, whose absence was lamented yesterday, codify personal property rights within their extra diegetic morality system. How time and again commerce is deified and lethal force in the defense or acquisition of property is explicitly expected. And indeed, in the upcoming chapter accompanying this, I probably will, because there I have 20 pages instead of 20 minutes, so stay tuned for that. But for the purposes of this presentation, let's extrapolate the belief that informs so many of these systems straight from the creator statements instead. And here lies the rub. War never changes, and neither do the men or women that wage it. The core assumption that permeates so much of Western post-apocalyptic fiction, and certainly the Fallout franchise, in all its various permutations. Civilization is a thin blanket woven from the implicit threat of state violence and control. The very moment where these enforcement mechanisms fail, out come the hockey masks. The post-apocalypse is a free-for-all, where a drastically diminished population viciously competes for the scraps necessary to survive, and who will, given the chance, devour each other, figuratively, and as Joshua Sawyer lamented yesterday, literally. The Fallout franchise is utterly permeated by this underlying distrust of human nature. There are countless examples of people who are transparently repeating the mistakes of the past or clinging to it. And there are countless more examples of those who have decided that to steal from their neighbors and getting into gunfights about it is an easier and safer path to prosperity and survival than to pick up a plow. Raiders and slavers are easily the most commonly fought enemy type, no matter where in post-war America the story is set. In terms of who or what is actually encountered by the player, violent junkies in hockey masks outnumber the peaceful residents of the wasteland by an order of magnitude. But even on a macro scale, most of these games features battles for supremacy, often fighting over scarce resources like water or energy. For war never changes, and neither does humanity. Even the aforementioned, more overtly anti-capitalist entries in the franchise cannot shake this. Here we have a picture of the first responders from Fallout 76, who are a very altruistic organization at first glance, but at the same time, they are explicitly painted as gullible, as naive, their altruism making them unable to deal with the harshness of the wasteland. And ultimately, their first foray into Appalachia ended in complete disaster, in no small part because the various survivors could not unite against the threat in time. Conversely, we have stories in the micro, like the Mistress of Mystery questline, where a group of well-meaning vigilantes were ultimately torn apart, betrayed, and massacred out of personal greed and jealousy. On the other hand, there is a never-ending influx of raiders. There is a never-ending influx of cannibals and murderers and people who have deliberately and gleefully decided that murder is easier than farming, but to steal is more convenient than to forage. Even the biggest settlement, which we saw before in post-war Appalachia, is utterly devastated and wiped out by raider pettiness and cruelty. The television show does not escape this either. At the core of its story stands, once again, a vicious fight over a power source. But even on a personal level, the show hardly displays much faith in people at large. Lucy enters the wasteland with bright-eyed optimism, but at every turn, this optimism isn't just disappointed, it's downright played for laughs. Wherever she goes, Lucy is the odd woman out, and she is punished and mocked for her willingness to do right by others. The denizens of the wasteland cannot be trusted and even small acts of kindness or mercy, like Titus saving the life of his knight or sparing a fellow squire, are immediately punished. The only community that is a little different, the vault that Lucy and Titus travel through, is hidden away from the wasteland, and even there, the fact that they aren't duplicitous, that they aren't secretly malicious, is played as a humorous twist, is played to subvert the expectation that the audience is meant to have. Conversely, the vault-dwelling society that instilled Lucy's optimism is every bit as sinister and cruel, their apparent goodness not at all born from genuine altruism, but rather a thin coat of paint over the personal dollhouse attached to a corporate doomsday bunker. Time and again, it's made clear that only an exceptional few people are even remotely trustworthy, and most are out to rob, cheat, and murder the protagonists. Human nature is to be selfish, violent, and cruel, and even the end of the world did not change that. Now, as popular as this belief is in our contemporary culture, and as foundational as it stands at the core of modern Western post-apocalyptic fiction, and certainly the Fallout franchise, there's 2 points to be made here. The first is that this is by no means a belief free of ideological underpinnings. There exists a clear line from Hobbes to Rand to the strange flowers of modern day libertarian belief that relies on this idea of a thoroughly selfish human that requires extensive policing and an organization of society around catering to and harnessing that selfishness, and to contain the more nasty, brutish, and dark impulses. The second important thing to mention here is this actually true? Now, I'm not about to make any sweeping statements about what human nature is or isn't, and there's relatively little empirical studies on the actual nuclear apocalypse as of yet. But there have absolutely been a number of existentially threatening catastrophes that we can observe in recent memory and with increasing frequency. And for anyone that's from around here, I apologize for this getting quite so topical for a moment. What we find in those moments is not chaos, hockey masks, and immediate cannibalism. In fact, the only significant violence we can observe in situations of extreme floods, earthquakes, or tropical storms usually originates from those who have emboldened by the state to enjoy and habitually exercise their monopoly on violence. But outside of those fringe cases, we see people pulling each other from the water. We see people sheltering their neighbors. We see an outpouring of solidarity. This is an image from the hurricane that hit Houston some years back, and of the veritable impromptu armada of Texans that descended upon Houston because they happened to own boats, and they did not come to loot, they came to rescue people. I still vividly remember the beginnings of the lockdowns at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. I remember the village I live in self-organizing. I remember student groups at my university forming to ease the isolation or help the elderly and at risk with groceries. And I remember that this outpouring of solidarity and community only really began to fade once deliberate efforts were undertaken to shift the narrative, once selfishness became induced and became politically and institutionally sanctioned. Or for a less heavily politicized example, when Fallout 76 launched, a big deal was made of the ability to drop nukes on other players, to launch more nuclear strikes and continue the never-changing war. And we can find sources like this message from the overseer in the game that very explicitly suggest that beyond the mechanical encouragement of finding the best loot at ground zero, The developers very clearly expected the players to engage in nuclear warfare against each other. But that's not what happened. In reality, the starting area is full of discount storefronts. The donation boxes are perpetually filled, and I have only ever seen players coordinate on a server to drop the nuke in an open field and farm ground zero in jolly cooperation. The vast majority of people, when faced with shared adversity, do not reflexively resort to selfishness and violence. They fall back on solidarity and cooperation. And where they do not, it's usually due to an outside narrative or hierarchy that has emboldened them to act antisocial. Now, I don't mean to insinuate that the creators of Fallout, be they the original developers or the modern day showrunners, are intentionally spreading propaganda. Rather, I mean to suggest that post-apocalyptic fiction is one of the clearest, most visible expressions of a different phenomenon that was also touched upon yesterday. In 2006, Mark Fisher succinctly paraphrased Frederick Jameson with a quote, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." In his book, Fisher describes the pervasive limitations that capitalism imposes onto not just the tangible world, but onto imagination itself. And it is this exact phenomenon we can observe in the Fallout franchise. The original creators could not, and as we found out yesterday with the exception of Mr. Sawyer, seem to be unable to conceive of a world where humans are not in fierce, deadly competition for supremacy, any more than they could conceive of a world without hierarchical power structures or a world without currency-driven commerce. Because it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalist beliefs and systems. To borrow a phrase from Laurent Barthes, these deeply ideologically informed assumptions of capitalism have coagulated into natural belief. The Fallout franchise and the many games, movies, stories that it draws upon, or that draw upon it, are a part of this cycle of mythical speech perpetuation, which was also alluded to yesterday, though I am rather less hopeful in this context about the ability of the signified to remain present in the sign. The belief that a world after nuclear war would be a violent dog-eat-dog and man-eat-man world stands as a core conceit of the Fallout franchise by the creator's own statement. Not because of any kind of ideological intent, at least as far as I can tell, but because the underlying beliefs come natural. And in turn, those beliefs come natural, at least in part, because on top of the ideological actors advocating for them, there is 1,000 stories like these that the Fallout games draw upon, or that draw upon the Fallout games. And that is how the deeply neoliberal cultural logic of the post-apocalyptic genre coagulates. And as writers, as creators of games, these are the kind of biases that we ought to look out for, so that if we make an ideological statement, if we engage in mythical speech, we at the very least do it intentionally. Thank you for your time.